The Enlightenment may have been anti-clerical, but it wasn't especially anti-religious. There were a handful of card-carrying atheists among its luminaries: Godwin, Holbach, Helvetius, Diderot, La Métrie, Montesquieu, Benjamin Franklin, but such rank unbelief was rare in the current as a whole. The great majority of these zealots of reason clung still to some species of religious faith. Newman and Joseph Priestley were Christians, while Locke, Shaftesbury, Voltaire, Tyndall, Paine and Jefferson were deists. The Scottish Enlightenment was in general averse to both atheism and materialism. Rousseau was a theist, while Lessing, along with many another thinker, argues for a unity of reason and revelation. Herder, though a cleric, rejected the notion of a personal God, but was a Spinozist of sorts, steering a somewhat unsteady course between supernaturalism and materialism. Pierre Bayle, scourge of superstition and priestly despotism, viewed popular religious belief as psychopathological, but accepted the existence of God. Kant, the greatest Aufklärer of them all, was no enemy of religion. The Enlightenment may have sought to reconstruct morality on a more rational basis, but the morality that it sought to reconstruct was largely Christian. For a long time after the word atheist was invented in the 16th century, many people doubted that such a position was really possible, and atheism didn't really become commonplace until well into the 18th century. It was religion as an instrument of social oppression, the unholy alliance of throne and altar, which drove the philosophe to fury, not the Almighty as such. Politics, not theology, priestcraft rather than divine power, was what was primarily at stake. All history was the history of struggle against a power-hungry clerical caste. Jonathan Israel claims that the theological debate lay at the heart of the early Enlightenment, but he seems to mean by this what he goes on to call its relentless war against ecclesiastical authority. Hegel remarks in the Phenomenology of Spirit that the Enlightenment's abiding concern was the battle against religion, but he too seems to be thinking primarily of religion in institutional terms, as institutional power. On the whole, Ernst Cassirer's verdict that this current of ideas wasn't especially or essentially irreligious seems, I think, fairly just. By and large, the Enlightenment wasn't out to abolish religion, but to provide it with a new set of rationales suitable to a secular age. It was a lot keener on rational or natural religion than it was on atheistic materialism. The task was to replace a barbarous, benighted version of religious faith, one expounded by a scruffy plebeian Jew in an obscure corner of the globe in an age of appalling savagery, with one that might grace coffee-house conversation in the Strand. Christianity, for many such revisionists of the Enlightenment, was simply one expression of natural religion, and thus true to the extent to which it was essentially superfluous. Edward Herbert of Charbury believed that the Ten Commandments could be derived from rational principles, which is rather like believing that Magna Carta can be deduced from the laws of physics. Perhaps I should add, incidentally, that I'm a champion of the Enlightenment as well as a critic of it, as of course was Karl Marx. Nobody aware of the undialectical attitude to the Enlightenment of certain strains of theology not a million light years from where we are at the moment could doubt the need to affirm that case. It would be wrong, however, I think, to give the impression that the philosophes' aversion to the alliance of throne and altar reflected a robust political radicalism. There was, to be sure, a radical enlightenment of great courage and intellectual richness, but the Newtonians, for example, formed a patrician culture well entrenched at court. Descartes, Leibniz and Newton were all champions of the established churches of their time and, for the most part, of the monarchy as well. As Margaret Jacob comments, the major 17th century proponents of the mechanical world picture were quite willing to see their scientific principles and methodological insights enlisted in the ideological service of strong and authoritarian government and in support of New Testament orthodoxy. It's perhaps not irrelevant to this point that most of the leading Aufklärer were impeccably well-bred in background. Holbach and Montesquieu were barons, Condorcet was a marquis, and Condillac was an abbé. Voltaire hailed from the minor gentry, grew immensely rich, and lived like an aristocrat. Helvetius, son of a millionaire courtier, made a fortune as a tax farmer. Gibbon was the child of a prosperous landowner, while Jeremy Bentham lived off inherited income. Rousseau, Diderot, and Jefferson were among the few of modest stock among this gallery of noblemen and haute bourgeois. They were an eminently respectable bunch of iconoclasts. The social background of the German idealists and romantics of Kant, Schiller, Herder, Hegel, Fichte, Jacobi, Hamann, Novalis, and Hölderlin were notably less distinguished. I think this is more than a sociological curio. It's also the site of a real political and ideological problem. If many of these thinkers pleaded for a rational religion, it was among other things because to link reason and religion, to link religion and rationality, was for them to span the gap between the masses and themselves meaning the more progressively minded upper classes. This was politically desirable, since for a governing class to hold one worldview and its underlings another is scarcely conducive to political stability. It's imprudent for the rulers to worship reason and the masses to worship the Virgin Mary. The problem, however, was that the masses were thought impervious to rationality. The more radical of the Aufklärer, like Paine and Godwin, held indeed to the possibility of general enlightenment, but this faith was conspicuously lacking among their more conservative colleagues. Friedrich Schiller, who was rattled by the prospect of popular sovereignty, doubted that the common people were capable of the civic virtue required for a true republic. His notion of aesthetic education was intended, among other things, as an alternative to revolutionary turmoil. So, if reason and religion couldn't commingle, one might have to settle instead for the so-called double truth thesis, a thesis to be found in our own time in the work of the neoconservative philosopher Leo Strauss, Eminence grise behind the throne of George W. Bush. According to this doctrine, reason and religion must coexist cheek by jowl without seeking to converge. In this way, the skepticism or theological rationalism of the elite would be kept from infecting the piety of the people, and this was desirable since the upshot of such infection might well be political dissent. There must be one God for the rich and another for the poor. As Bishop Butler complained, a rational faith dispels the mystery of God with its intolerable mathematical clarity, thus undermining reverence and humility. Bishop Berkeley and the Anglo-Irish hierarchy of Dublin, confronted by a permanently disaffected Irish populace, were in entire agreement. So was their political compatriot Edmund Burke. To demystify divine truths was to demystify the authority of those who promulgated them. You can rationalize religion, as in some of Fichte's more audacious writings, or banish it from the sphere of reason altogether, as in the various fideisms of the age, but the former is unlikely to suit the masses, and the latter unlikely to satisfy the intelligentsia. Friedrich Jacobi thought the two camps were simply speaking past one another. For some of these thinkers, Christian faith might be largely a load of old nonsense, but it was an edifying, unifying, morally chastening and disciplining load of old nonsense, installing awe and respect for authority in unlettered breasts, and reason should keep its hands well off it. A banal version of this case is now being peddled by Alain de Botton. The notoriously sceptical Gibbon thought aspects of the religion he scoffed at could nonetheless prove highly socially productive. David Hume, who was probably either an atheist or a diluted deist, also thought religion to be of some social utility. Even Diderot, who wrote that if Jesus had fondled the breasts of the bridesmaids of Cana and caressed the buttocks of St. John, Christianity might be a good deal better off, nonetheless supported natural religion because of its socially cohesive effects. That, by the way, is the only sentence of this lecture you'll remember in 2 weeks' time. Montesquieu didn't believe in God, but considered it prudent that others should. The magnificent John Toland, rumoured to be the bastard offspring of a spoilt priest and a prostitute, thought, despite this familiarity with the common people, that the higher truths of religion didn't mix well with them. I don't believe, but it's politically advisable that you should, was the tacit, deeply disingenuous slogan of this whole lineage. Condorcet despised such intellectual double-dealing, trusting as he did that progressive principles would gradually penetrate even what he called the hovels of slaves. But others were a good deal less sanguine. Voltaire held that the masses would always be benighted and was notoriously nervous of contaminating his own servants with his religious unorthodoxy. Jonathan Swift held much the same view of the lower orders. Both men believed, with the Nietzsche of the joyful wisdom, that there was no point in trying to bring reason to bear on the populace. The people, as Nietzsche puts it there, ever lieth and will only be unsettled by a parade of rational argument. Better for them to stew quietly away in the juice of their superstition. This way, social order would be more effectively secured. So the choice was between a conveniently docile populace whose primitive religious views brought into question your own trust in the universality of reason, and a reasonable populace who validated that trust, but only at the price of potential political disaffection. There was another problem too. The critical, negative, rationalist views of the Enlightenment were essential to their assault on the old order, but were scarcely the kind of ideas that could legitimate a new one. Hegel found this whole worldview marked by what he called a colourless, empty brand of rationality. It was too lacking in emotional and imaginative resources, too shorn of a symbolic dimension to offer modernity an effective means of self-legitimation. It couldn't engage the allegiance of the masses, who were more interested in religious consolation than in cosmic harmony. As Cardinal Newman writes of 19th century liberalism, it is too cold a principle to prevail with the multitude. What is this highly praised reason, sneers Johann Hamann, the ne'er-do-well son of a Königsberg bathkeeper, with its universality, infallibility, overweeningness, certainty, self-evidence? It is a stuffed dummy which the howling superstition of reason has endowed with divine attributes. And the problem will become more acute as industrial capitalist society unfolded. Liberalism and utilitarianism, its dominant ideologies, don't fare well as symbolic forms. Instead, as in the radical romantic legacy from Coleridge to Ruskin, the social order would need to co-opt certain more traditional values, faith, loyalty, reverence, organic bonds, metaphysical sanctions, hierarchical order, if it was to make up for a certain symbolic and emotional deficit in the governing ideologies. Mill incongruously yoking Coleridge to Bentham is a case in point. As a naturally fragmented and divided place, market society has to import from elsewhere the corporate identity it needs to buttress its authority, and in doing so had to weather some pretty abrasive criticism as well from the radical romantic heritage that it used for this purpose. The more soullessly materialist social life becomes, the more archaic and elaborate grow its various imported spiritual legitimations, but therefore the more implausible as well. Secular social orders need such quasi-spiritual legitimations, but they can't avoid bringing them into discredit, since the contrast with their own profane activities is too glaringly apparent. Societies like this tend then to undermine the very symbolic resources they need to underpin their power. The problem reaches a surreal climax in mid-19th century in the thought of Auguste Comte, whose full-blooded scientific rationalism feels the need to summon to its aid a whole panoply of secular churches, priests, prayers, sacraments, feast days and the like, if it's to have the slightest hope of selling itself to the common people. It's also evident today in Hollywood, where spirituality means whatever is the polar opposite of your own grubby materialism, and thus offers a fantasy refuge from it. Scientology, package Kabbalah, ready-to-serve transcendental meditation, spaceships parked behind clouds and other such weighty theological phenomena. Rationalist societies, in other words, tend not only to diminish their own symbolic resources, but to pathologize them as well. The place where ideas bed themselves down in lived experience, fleshing themselves out as spontaneous action and allegiance, is known as culture. As Burke and de Maistre understood, customs, pieties, affections and affinities are the sediment into which power must settle itself if it's not to prove too rebarbatively abstract. The Enlightenment, however, with its universalism and cosmopolitanism, was not much interested in such lowly corporeal affairs, which is where the idealism and romanticism which follow in its wake had the advantage over it. Theology has been so long a queen, remarks a character in Iris Murdoch's novel The Time of the Angels. She thinks she can still rule as a queen in disguise. One might come up with worse accounts, worse descriptions of both idealism and romanticism, which on the very cusp of a secularizing industrial capitalist order, an emergent order, look back to traditional belief at the same time as they recast it in suitably secular terms, refurbishing ideas like grace, sin, guilt, spirit, redemption, providence, teleology, and the like for their own largely profane ends. Indeed, one might claim that a key feature of this natural supernaturalism, as it's been dubbed, is aesthetics, which emerges at the heart of the Enlightenment in the mid-18th century in our own modern sense of it, and which then acts as a kind of bridge or transition between an age of faith and an age of reason. Almost all aesthetic terms are fragments of displaced theology: creation, inspiration, unity, symbol, infinity, self-foundedness, epiphany, the holiness of the imagination, and the spirit of nature, the quidditas of created things, and so on. The point is to preserve the religious impulse while translating it into naturalistic terms. By replacing the rational principles of the Enlightenment with spiritual ones, idealism and romanticism are more likely to claim the hearts and minds of the people, one might consider. Art, as Herder argues, must have its roots in the fertile soil of local and national cultures, hardly a case one could imagine Diderot or Samuel Johnson proposing. Yet the truth is that idealist philosophy and romantic poetry or aesthetics are every bit as remote from the common people as Spinoza's determinism or Newtonian physics. There must accordingly be some form of mediation between the truths of the poet or philosopher on the one hand and the everyday wisdom of the folk on the other, and this mediation, which for Schiller is aesthetic education, is aesthetics, is more generally known in the period as mythology. If religion has proved the most powerful and pervasive symbolic system known to humanity, it's among other things because it's able to combine the two main meanings of the word culture, the aesthetic and the anthropological ones, culture as higher or deeper truth, culture as form of life. Within its institutions, priests and people, intelligentsia and masses, reason and piety, transcendent truth and commonplace practice, the unfathomable mysteries of the cosmos, and the necessity of not fornicating or defrauding are brought together. The two meanings of culture are magically yoked together. No rival symbolic system has ever been able to hold a candle to that astonishing synthesis. But mythology seemed to some idealists and romantics to provide a secular alternative. And that much is apparent from the anonymous document we know as the oldest systematic program of German idealism, written in Hegel's handwriting, but probably composed by Schelling, which insists that, I quote, unless we make ideas aesthetic, i.e. mythological, they will have no interest for the people. If philosophy is to hold sway over the multitude, there must be what the document calls a religion of the senses, which is to say what it also calls a mythology of reason. Mythology must become philosophical to make people rational, the program declares, and philosophy must become mythological to make philosophers sensuous. There have, to be sure, been philosophers, Bertrand Russell springs to mind, whose sensuality hadn't the slightest need of mythology, indeed has become something of a myth in its own right. Nothing could be further from this statement than the thought of the later Hegel, for whom philosophy has superseded the sensory image, or from the austerely Protestant iconoclasm of a Kant. The marriage of philosophy and image in mythology, of idea and image as mythology, is in effect a form of class collaboration at the level of the intellect. To unite the two is to invest ideas with all the palpable force of image and fable, and thus to bring reason within the ambit of the common people. All the wealth of human knowledge and happiness consists in images, exclaims Johann Georg Hamann. It's certainly true of his own fervid prose style. The unification of reason and sense has always been, in one way or another, a political allegory for the reconciliation of rulers and populace, which is to say that epistemology has always been at some level politics, and it had now happened upon a different form. Culture, in the sense of precious and imperishable values and ideas, could become, through the mediation of myth, culture in the everyday or anthropological sense. Myth might provide the vital hinge or pivot between these two increasingly separate meanings of the term. It would serve then as a form of displaced religion to join all of those surrogates for religion that litter the modern age: art, culture, reason, Geist, humanity, society, Durkheim, the nation, the people, psychoanalysis, and of course sport, the current opium of the people. Of these, the greatest is undoubtedly culture. Yet this mythologizing project too, which survives as late as Nietzsche and Wagner, was finally to fail. The more noxious aspects of it expired in the rubble of the Third Reich. The last gasp of it as a serious political program can just about be heard in the writings of Georges Sorel. To imagine that you can legislate myth into existence, as some of the early romantics and idealists rather naively imagined, is itself ironically a rationalist assumption. Schelling speaks rather more realistically, though still with a touch of pathos, of waiting upon history to, as he says, return mythology to us as a universally valid form. It was not here that the most powerful modern alternative of this period, at least, to religion was to be found. The whole mythologizing project still smacked too much of the academic closet. So indeed did the contemporary and related current of Hellenism, a fascinating tale I've no time to take up here. What broke out of that closet, surely with a vengeance, was the single most astonishingly successful revolutionary movement of modernity, a direct offspring of both idealism and romanticism, which was to transform the face of the globe. I'm speaking, of course, of nationalism, of revolutionary nationalism, which, as we see from the pages of Herder and Fichte, was the moment at which the concept of culture in the modern age first acquired its depth and resonance, long before the development of anthropology, or indeed later on of the culture industry. Culture in the shape of nationalism was a potent displacement of God. Like the Almighty, the nation was sacred, eternal, autonomous, self-creating, indivisible, without end or origin, the ground of all being, the source of personal identity, the principle of humanity, the champion of the dispossessed, transcendent of individuals, unworthy not only of their faith, but also of their literal self-sacrifice. The nation is honoured by solemn rites and furnished with its own pantheon of secular saints or patriotic heroes. By the middle of the 20th century, it even had something of the ubiquitousness of the Almighty as well. Nothing is more international than nationalism. In the hyphenated phenomenon of the nation-state, reason, the state, politics, legality, institutional life, and culture, kinship, nation, piety, sentiment, affection are fused to produce one of the most formidable political phenomena of modernity. Artists, scholars, and intellectuals find themselves making common cause with the activism of the people, the relation between, as it were, the reason and the senses. A certain progressive wing of the ruling class and the populace as a whole is fleshed out in newfound roles, new roles of leadership, of advice, and so on, for intellectuals themselves. It was everything that the romantic radicals had dreamed of. This enthralling narrative, by the way, will continue tomorrow for anybody who's interested in knowing what happens next. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your lecture. Now we have time for questions from the audience. But because we are ruled by technology, yeah. You also want to.
Come on, be brave. Your opening comments regarding the Enlightenment attitude towards religion, you seem to make a distinction between religion as institution versus the actual beliefs. You seem to separate those two, and I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because that's one of the things that struck me the most, is that assumption that was unstated regarding the separation of the two.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd be deeply skeptical, as it were, about that separation in general. Yes, ideas are, in a sense, institutional, in at least a neutral sense of the word institutionality. And indeed, it's a rather it's a loss, isn't it, that the word institutionalized or institutional has become so pejorative, so inherently negative and derogatory. A handshake is an institution. A kiss is an institution. But yes, I think that does happen. I'm not saying that it's all to the good, as it were. I'm not necessarily valorizing that. But the difficult trick to pull off for many of those thinkers, I think, was precisely to put a lot of daylight between themselves and the religious institution, while clinging to some therefore increasingly abstract and cerebral, rationalistic, and therefore, as it were, politically increasingly untenable kind of theology. And that, as it were, that divorce, that really rather disabling divorce between religion as institution, religion as theology or ideas, was being, as it were, forced upon them in that respect. You see what I mean? That was really what I was trying to argue. Yeah.
Terry, I wonder what you would say about the recent strong current in scholarship that has tended to make a much stronger division between idealist philosophy on the one hand and romantic philosophy on the other. I'm thinking particularly of Manfred Frank's work. So that while you were talking, I felt that what you were saying about the thesis of a sort of continuity with the Enlightenment and a kind of substitute for religion in terms of aesthetics and the naturalizing of the supernatural is truer of idealism than it is true of romanticism. I think one can argue, especially, you know, recalling the fact that, you know, Schlegel and Schleiermacher live in the same rooms. Schlegel eventually becomes a Catholic for highly serious intellectual reasons. Schleiermacher is a theologian. And I think that in the case of the Romantics, it's more as if they're saying, look, the arguments for Christianity have been on the wrong footing. If you leave out imagination and feeling and the aesthetic and the cultural, you know, that the appeal back to Christendom is in a way saying, look, the whole people made the argument for Christianity, the ordinary people. You can see this in the early Hugo as well. And I don't see why one can't approach this as a completely valid theological move rather than simply a surrogate theology. I think you can argue it the other way around. I think you can argue, I think Abrams is wrong, and there's just as much supernaturalizing of the natural going on as naturalizing the supernatural, if you're looking at the specifically romantic rather than idealist current.
Yes, it's a difficult point, isn't it, John? I mean, I think, I don't really know what I think about this. I mean, I think there are times when the distinction between the idealist and the romantic is hardly visible, where it's hair thin. You know? Yes, exactly, where you can move from one category to the other. And on the other hand, I think you're right, there are other times, or from other aspects, where the distinction looms pretty large and is important. And I think you're right. I think you're right about natural supernaturalism there. I don't think that's the point. But I wonder whether one could say that in a certain sense, idealism preserves the synthesis of the Enlightenment, but substitutes, as it were, essentially spiritual rather than rational principles for the debate. Yeah. So that to a certain extent, it remains caught within that problematic. It seems to me that Romanticism is more typically problematizes that synthesis or totality or groundedness, while still indeed, but in increasingly yearning kind of way, looking for it. I mean, I think that might be quite a productive distinction between the two currents, although that there's to some extent a darker underside to Romanticism in that way, not least, of course, in the realization of the dark side of the imagination, which cannot be unequivocally affirmed or celebrated, you know, as it is by almost every literary critic today, that the recognition of the losses that must be calculated in with gains and so on. Thinking maybe it's worth preserving the distinction in that respect, but I agree with you. It's certainly. Romanticism has seen something about the elusiveness of totalization or of centers, whereas the idealist to some degree is still working in that mode, I think.
Thank you very much. Professor Eagleton, a very simple question, if I may, but probably there's a complicated answer. Could you try to tell us a bit more about what you understand by mythology within the context of your lecture this evening?
I thought you were going to say something like, would you mind speaking up or something? Yeah. Or do you have the time? Yeah. Well, it's not an easy question to ask. It's much less easy than it seems, I would think, because there is a history to the term from, Schelling to Sorel or to Nietzsche, which is a difficult, complex one. But the idea that what is common to many of those meanings, I think, and what I was interested in, is just the idea that certain abiding and imperishable spiritual truths or principles can be fleshed out not only as image but as practice. Yes, this is where the rivalry to religion becomes very plain. That it is that mythology in that sense is a kind of body of belief, largely, of course, unconscious, spontaneous, instinctual, but in practice, yes, and therefore, and you get this still as late as, say, T.S. Eliot's social criticism, let alone Nietzsche, and therefore to be contrasted with an increasingly anemic and alienated reason. But of course, as I say, there are many different meanings here. If one thinks of, say, mythology in the hands of a Lévi-Strauss, then one's talking about a kind of a sensuous rationality, I suppose. Not, I mean, a rationality otherwise. I mean, the most interesting mythological project is to try, as it were, to develop a rationality which is otherwise, but is not simply a surrender to barbarous forms of irrationalism. Yes. So that Lévi-Strauss will see a certain kind of pensée sauvage as a sort of, you know, as a rationality, to be sure, but cast in different, if you like, in aesthetic terms. Thinking here of the original meaning of the aesthetic as perception and sensation. Mythology seems to offer the promise of bringing ideas and sensations together, but then, and in that, of course, it's long prefigured by the work of art. There are all kinds of ways in which the work of art, as defined, you know, from the Enlightenment onwards, is marvelously convenient in its bringing of, in its synthesizing of various opposites. One of which, to be sure, is reason and the sensuality or sensuousness, because the miracle of the work of art, among other kinds of miracles, is that its sort of rational law or design is absolutely indissociable from its instantiation in concrete particulars. Yes, it's as though that law dissolves magically, mysteriously. That kind of overall rationality of the work dissolves into its sensory presence. Yes, but the problem with that is there just aren't enough people concerned with works of art. You know, you're talking about a tiny social elite. Culture, in that sense, won't save you, though astonishingly, as late as, say, Mallarmé, T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, people are still speaking as though it will. It is quite astonishing how the belief in the redemptive powers of culture in the most specialist sense survive, as it were, the collapse of the high Victorian consensus, the trauma of the First World War, and so on. But it's an increasingly, I mean, the note of pathos there is increasingly plangent. And so to turn to some more general sense of culture, some more anthropological sense, culture as a form of life might save us. It's almost like a work of art on a large scale. I think that's part of what the conservative mythology is trying to do. Yes. Not just myths as ideas in people's heads, but what they live out spontaneously as part of their life forms.
Could you say a little bit more about the underlying causal framework that fits your narrative? Because I could hear the story you were telling of what changed, what gave rise to what, but I couldn't always pick out what you thought the underlying reasons were. And in particular, just to flesh that out, you started with raising the question of class and the position of the Enlightenment thinkers and how they were aspiring to reason, in a sense, to demarcate their class identity as somewhat separate from the masses, and had a great pessimism that the masses could ever be as reasonable as they could. It seemed to be a narrative of class, but then you moved on towards nationalism, where it was as though, could culture itself be an agent in history, I suppose is my question.
It's not just a narrative of class. if the trajectory of the narrative is somewhat obscure, it's because I'm condensing about 400 pages into 10 here. You know, something's got lost en route. And neither is it just about rationality as dividing the intelligentsia from the view. I'm much more urgently, it's a matter of trying to span that gap, yes, and the variety of ways in which that's tried on. In which, in other words, the way that religion is perceived to have done that is imitated more or less well. Now, within that, there is a kind of narrative about class, to be sure, insofar as I said, you know, there's a kind of political allegory going on here. It's dangerous to have discrepant forms of rationality in society, and so on. And all of this is happening exactly at the historical point where society is becoming more fragmented and divided. But I don't think that that's really what I'm calling the double truth thesis, yes. And that's one strand, important strand through the narrative, as will become extraordinarily clear tomorrow. Yeah. But it's not the only one, yes. It's a vital component. It's a spine through it, and it actually is, you know, do come back tomorrow, because you'll hear, you know, an exciting tale of how all that actually intensifies, goes at a gallop, you know, in the Victorian and modern periods. But the other motif, I think, in the argument, and I absolutely agree, it's very broken back as it stands here, is really the promise of the idea of culture, in either in its narrow or general, or more likely unite those two senses united, to resolve these problems. And just to, you know, let the cat out of the bag and reveal a bit of, you know, what happens at the end and so on. You can close your ears if you don't want to hear this now. Of course, culture too fails. I say that of all of these surrogates for religion, the greatest is culture, meaning it's the most likely and in many ways look the most promising candidate for this role, but actually that slides to a halt as well, I think. And that perhaps is not entirely unconnected with the current need or current desire, which I'll say something again about tomorrow, to sort of reinvent a rather de-gutted form of spirituality or religion, which, having, as it were, tried culture as a form of social cohesion, and that's failed for various reasons, then actually, you know, people like de Botton and others, John Gray perhaps, are actually trying to reinvent the project, the Arnoldian project really, which is sort of, you know, religion as poetry, religion without content, an aestheticized religion which might just provide a principle of spiritual unity. I mean, that doesn't work either. You
know. Professor Eagleton, I think I've read an article or an essay of yours where you criticise, I think correctly, Martin Amis, I think a few of his friends, maybe Christopher Hitchens, for focusing and criticising on radical Islam and not focusing on the crimes of their own state. I was wondering, do you write or speak much yourself about, say, Britain's support of Israeli atrocities or criticism of, you know, Iranian nuclear programs and that kind of thing?
Oh, did I say something about Martin Amis?
I think so. I can't remember where though.
Oh, yeah. Well, I just think it's extraordinary, you know, and it's not just Amis and Hitchens. It's a whole band of kind of sort of literal or spiritual North Oxford people. You know, Ian McEwan and Dawkins, and what strikes me as extraordinary about that is that the first people, as it were, to panic at the first onslaught of radical Islam, I mean in terms of the World Trade Center and so on, with a very metropolitan liberal literati who were supposed to be, you know, bearing the torch for tolerance and progress and enlightenment and so on. They were the people, you know, who ran first to man the barricades. Sam Harris, the American, you know, new atheist, so-called, in the very wake of 9/11, proclaiming that if a Muslim nation was to develop nuclear weapons, then we might have to make a preemptive nuclear strike against it. And if that involved the deaths of millions of people, then that was too bad. Harris is a liberal. God knows what his conservative comrades are saying about it. Yes. You know, this is the man who is poo-pooing religion and Christianity as barbarous superstition and so on. What has happened, of course, there is that God is still around, but now, you know, he's not the short-haired, blue-blazered God of civilization. He's the dark-skinned, barbarous, wrathful God of the other side. God is alive and kicking, but he's changed address, so to speak, and moreover seems to confront a Western civilization that, as far as its symbolic and spiritual resources go, is increasingly depleted and diminished at the very moment of political confrontation. I talked, if you remember in the talk, about the ways in which those kinds of societies, our kinds of societies, really can't help depleting their own spiritual resources simply by virtue of what they do, you know, the profane things they get up to. They bring their own rationales perpetually into a kind of discredit, and therefore they sort of spiritually disarm at the very moment they then confront, you know, a form of religious belief that, you know, would it didn't, but it has no doubt whatsoever about absolutes and foundations and metaphysical rationales and all the rest of it. Yeah. So yes, I mean, I do think that these ideas, as again I will show in this marvellous finale tomorrow, where I believe they're hiring buglers as well as all these lights and things, you know, I will try and show the bearing of this on, as it were, where we are right now.
Professor Eagleton, where would Tolkien fit into this idea of trying to legislate mythology and so on?
Could you just identify?
Here I am. Here.
Don't shout Heidi High or whatever they want you to shout here, you know.
I am here.
Oh, absolutely. There you are, yeah, right, okay, yes, just wave to the folks. Sorry, Tolkien?
Yes.
Oh, my goodness, I was hoping nobody would ask that. I've never read Lord of the Rings, actually. I mean, you know, life is too short for wads of donnish whimsy or bogus medievalism. But I suppose one would have to look at Tolkien in the light of that whole late modernist attempt to, you know, to weld some form of mythology, religion, aesthetics, idealized medievalism and so on together. I mean, there were a number of people doing that, weren't there, at the time. But the difference there is, of course, that although people like Eliot were certainly looking at the relations between culture and the organic society and religion, they were, of course, actual believers, you know, as, of course, we're talking. I mean, they were, whereas the trend I'm really talking about is that much more Arnoldian trend in which precisely what's embarrassing about Christianity, for example, is belief. If only you could somehow magically extract that, you know, and leave the rather high-minded resonance and radiant aura of it without the distressing belief in, you know, love or whatever it is, you know, then you'll be fine. At least when we're talking about that previous attempt at synthesis around Tolkien and certain other writers and the Moot and Eliot and so on, well, you were talking there about a more explicitly believing set of intellectuals, weren't you? And their problem was then, as it were, how do you translate those transcendent beliefs into daily practice? And culture once again becomes an important mediation there. But culture is important for these largely right-wing thinkers, not least because it means the unconscious. Culture is that which you do spontaneously as a flick of the wrist or a blink of the eye. It's nothing rational, so that the concept of culture is really appropriated at that point by a certain rather reactionary and conservative group, and it's not until the late 1950s with people like Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart and so on that there's a political fight over the concept of culture and it's sort of dragged slowly from the hands of the Eliots and the Tolkiens and the Henry Williamsons and so on.
I have a loud voice, I don't need a microphone.
Okay.
You promised us a lot for tomorrow, so I guess I should, put my faith in you and be patient. But somehow I already have this nostalgic feeling that we are leaving Romanticism for good, and moving to later 19th century. So I wanted to ask you to clarify certain thing. The way you defined mythology implies an answer why mythology was not a successful surrogate. It was too complicated, too complex for the common people, but maybe you could tell us a bit more about why was nationalism so successful in that? You mentioned basically two basic things, mythology and nationalism as a kind of romantic inputs. And also, another aspect of this question is, if we can provide an answer why certain surrogates of religion, as you call it, were so successful, then maybe it brings us to the answer why religion itself was so successful. And are there any parallels to that?
I don't think, I didn't really mean that mythology failed because it was too complex. I meant that it failed until, for example, one form that it took was, in a sense, Hellenism, was the desire to return to an ancient form of organic society and so on, which simply wasn't feasible, of course. But it's not that it failed as long as it couldn't translate itself into a practical political force. And the point I was making about nationalism, I should have made it better, is that that's what happens. It's with nationalism. That's not the only reason, of course, for the enormous success of nationalism. There are many quite more prosaic political reasons for it. But with nationalism, that mythology is fleshed out and becomes an active force, an active historical and political force. Of course, in right-wing and conservative nationalism quite as much as in revolutionary nationalism. So that does mythology fail? No, not if you look at the Nazis, not if you look at the ability of a noxious mythology to install itself in, the crevices of the common life. But it will fail unless it finds that political point of realization. And with nationalism it finds, I think, such a form, just as the romantic radical legacy I was talking about from whatever, Coleridge to Ruskin, whatever you like, finds just after Ruskin, with William Morris, a practical political form in the form of the workers' movement, of socialism, of Marxism, and so on. Yes. Before it does that, and unless it does that, it's going to be forced into increasingly fantastic and pathological forms. Yeah. But once it does that, then culture can become a kind of, a living idea. And I think the same thing happens with mythology once nationalism happens along, yes. But that's too late for some of the originary mythological thinkers, as it were.
If I could ask a related question. If we look at your intellectual genealogy or sort of heritage building between the figures of the Enlightenment and this jump towards this movement of nationalism, I was wondering what a category of ecclesiology and where that would fit within your narrative in terms of this political touch point of where culture making takes place and where that would fit within the sort of overall narrative you're attempting to develop.
Yes. Well, it's not, I don't think it's quite a jump, actually. You say a jump. Not really. I mean, nationalism emerges as a political force and as an ideological current out of the Romantic and, among other sources, also from the Enlightenment, to be sure, but out of the intellectual movements I was speaking of. It's a counter movement, isn't it? It's a dissident movement. Thinking in theological or ecclesiastical terms, it's a movement that flings itself at what it sees as a powerful establishment, and yet which becomes one itself, of course, in its time. It's also, in some of its forms, messianic. Yes, it's most certainly in some sense providential, teleological, yes. Even though the nation, strictly speaking, has no origin or end, like the Almighty himself, nevertheless it takes on, it's incarnate in secular time and so on. And it has an overwhelming belief in the deed, isn't it? You know? In the irruption into the active irruption into history, so that in it, I mean, within that enormously complex movement, certain radical romantic ideas are not only kept warm, but actually become a new form of global politics. I'm not saying nationalism is reducible to that, but yes. But I haven't really thought about the question. I'm trying to disguise the fact I haven't thought about the question at all. But any simple translation between, I mean, I'm not really kind of basically concerned with, you know, one-to-one translations between the secular and the sacred, if you like. It's an interesting question, but although, I mean, I don't know whether, you know, it might be perhaps a little reductive to see nationalism as occupying a certain ecclesiological or theological. It's a mélange like these other currents, you know, and all kinds of rather heteroclite, displaced theologies can be found. I mean, Patrick Pearse, you know, perhaps the most religious of the Irish revolutionists, didn't only think that nationalism was religious, he thought it was specifically Roman Catholic. I wonder he didn't think, you know, nationalism meant not eating meat on Friday or something, you know. So there you find, I mean, with certain aspects of the of 1916, Dublin 1916, you find an extraordinarily precise translation of the one into the other, you know. But I wouldn't take that as a kind of general model, that's all.
Hear me? No. Oh. I know I've got the microphone, but may I ask one quick question? I was thinking of Alain de Derrière, or Alain de Bottom, and his notion that of culture and nature and how religion can be used for the cultural good. Yeah, we can have nice buildings and temples and things that we can all go and be nice about. But isn't, as Latour rightly said, the very division between culture and nature the very defining thing of modernism? And that we have to somehow reconfigure it completely. And in light of what's happened, say, last 100 years, it's not just about art galleries, which are cultural artifacts or cultural places, but people are cultural. And what I mean, the concept of a person is as arbitrary now as the Tate modern. All things are up for grabs. It's not simply here's nature and here's culture. And isn't it that nature is cultural, but also culture is natural? And only in that way do we have any beginning of a true debate.
That's an interesting point. I'm a little suspicious of chiasmic devices, as you, that is to say, X is Y and Y is X. I'm also, although being certainly, you know, as an individual cultured myself, indeed I would say highly cultivated.
It's got a good nature.
Supposed to be funny, but it doesn't matter. I mean, they're paying my travel expenses. Anyway. I actually, I'm not actually, I think, a culturalist in the sense that I don't think that human individuals are reducible to culture. I think culturalism of the postmodern variety is quite as much a form of reduction as, say, economism or biologism. And I don't believe, you know, I'm just a good old unreconstructed materialist here, I don't believe that culture goes all the way down. If culture does go all the way down, incidentally, it becomes a kind of yet another surrogate form of transcendence. It's that you can't really dig behind. Yes, it's the. I don't believe that. I mean, I certainly, of course, think that that culture is of our nature. That's to say, in more, in less highfalutin terms, unless somebody speaks to the baby. and cares for it, culture in that very broad sense, it's going to die. There's a whacking great hole in its nature, which is part of our species being, which means that culture must move in upon those natural little individuals we call babies and toddlers very swiftly, otherwise they're not going to survive. Culture, is to that extent is vital to us, just as, forgive me if you've heard me say this before, culture is vital in this sense as well, which is quite a different sense, that it can be defined succinctly as what people will kill for. Culture in our world today is most definitely what people are prepared to die for or to kill for. I don't mean, they're prepared to die for Anthony Trollope, or kill for Chopin. There might be some seriously strange little group of people hiding away who are prepared to do that. But, culture in a broad sense, most certainly people. So it would be hard, what I mean is, it would be hard to underestimate the importance of culture in that sense. Even so, I think it is commonly inflated in its significance because, in one sense, when you strip culture away from human beings, when you strip civilization away from them, you have a kind of nothingness because that culture is constitutive of their nature, and yet at the same time, as King Lear shows us, it's then that you see what's most human about them. It's when the cultural lendings are stripped off that you see what they share most basically with other people of the same kind. But I don't want to keep you standing up. You see. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, okay. Yeah.
There's one sentence that you said about sport and it being
oh, yes.
the opium or...
Yeah, the opium of the people, yes.
Could you tell me what you mean by that? I take a malicious, a sadistic delight in saying that to taxi drivers, whenever they say to me, "Are you going to the big game?" I don't only say, "What big game?" I lean across and tell them very earnestly that I think sport should be abolished, as soon as possible. The number of taxis I've been ejected from is unbelievable. Actually, they don't take me seriously. They don't believe anybody could think that, really. They think I'm just having a joke. No, I'm not having a joke. Absolutely not. Not only the opium of the people, but almost the crack cocaine, you might say, in certain ways. I mean, that sport is in all kinds of ways a brilliant surrogate religion. It has almost everything that religion has apart from God, and you can bring him in if you like as well, Liturgy, pantheon of heroes, histories, traditions, communal celebrations. But it also, of course, has rivalry and competition and division and individualism and all of that. Where would our rulers be without it? People might begin to look at other matters for a change, Their minds might not be distracted from, the obscenity of bankers every Saturday, I really would like to know, in this kind of thought experiment, what a late capitalist society without sport would be like. In the States, of course, it's even worse, because sport writes large almost all of the treasured American characteristics, grit, strength, determination, individualism, competition, robustness, team spirit. It marvelously combines the cooperative and the competitive, the communal and individual. I just hope, that as tickets get more and more expensive, fewer and fewer people will be able to go, and the whole thing will collapse, overnight. But I think that's happened to Rangers.
Dead right. The thin end of the wedge, I hope.
Thank you so much, Professor Eagleton.
Not at all.
Thank you all for coming, and hope to see you tomorrow at the same time.